Well, I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers for this rather, for this opportunity. I'll be as kind as I can. We've had a very rich and complex discussion, a very impressive group of panelists, in fact, even an intimidating set of panelists. And so summing this up on a late Saturday afternoon is a challenge, to put it mildly. I'll do what I can, and I'll try and do it as quickly as I can. I'll give you my second thoughts, and unfortunately, they are sober. One quick comment before I get into the substance to Senator Cohen. You said that staying where you live is a simple question. For someone living in Vancouver but clinging by his fingernails to the Alberta healthcare system, it's become a remarkably complex question, and I'm glad I'm not up for Senate appointment. It feels good to me to be back in the fray. Senate reform seldom pops up at the neighborhood Starbucks where I go. It's not a big issue. Senate reform, though, for political scientists like myself, is a bit like dermatology for physicians, right? It's the ideal illness. Patients never recover, but they never die. Senate reform is somewhat like that. So, unlike Anne, I liked David Smith's reference to Thomas Becket. That is, the old questions, the old answers. There's nothing like it. But I think we can do more. I've been immersed in Senate reform issues for 33 years. I don't mention this as a matter of pride or accomplishment, but rather to stress that the world has changed rather dramatically since the contemporary Senate reform debate got underway in the early 1980s. That debate was kicked off, I would argue, in the West. The Triple E Senate and the West Wants In were joined at the hip, and the hip was the Reform Party of Canada. Senate reform was seen as a way of counterbalancing Quebec's dominance, real or perceived, of the national government. And the cleavages at that time were the cleavages that Bruce Hicks talked about, regional cleavages and linguistic cleavages. Well, the world has changed, thankfully, in a very dramatic way since that time. The West is in. So too are Aboriginal peoples, in a way that complicates the Senate reform debate tremendously. Provincial governments are, if anything, more powerful than they were in the past. Regional tensions, I would argue, have diminished. And more importantly, regional identities, I feel, have diminished as well. And our national preoccupation with the place of Quebec in the Federation has waned somewhat. Again, the west coast of Vancouver or west coast of BC has waned considerably. However, our discussions of Senate reform are still focused on the Canada of the 1980s. We're hurtling down the highway with our eyes firmly fixed on the rearview mirror. But of course, we're not hurtling anywhere. We're stuck in the legal mud of Senate reform. Linda noted the mantra, Senate reform requires constitutional change, and constitutional change is impossible. Stéphane gave a very vigorous voice to this mantra today. And we hear time and time again that no one wants to reopen the Constitution. The only people who are not asked are Canadians, but other people don't want to reopen it. And if I understood Kate Glover correctly, and I hope I didn't, the Supreme Court is pulling political conventions into the formal constitutional structure and thus into its own field of play. So I found the first panel today to actually be very depressing, very informative, very invigorating, but also depressing in the sense that it underscored this message. We really can't do anything. So as Peter Carver pointed out at the beginning of that session, the Senate reform debate has been transformed in a very important way. It's almost an entirely a debate about the how of Senate reform rather than a debate about the why of Senate reform. And if the debate is about how, the legal community seems to step in and say, not on our watch will this happen. We had a great question from the floor, I think, from Mr. Fletcher, who pointed out that the discussion is about how Senate reform cannot be accomplished rather than perhaps why it should be accomplished. So this brings me to an ongoing frustration that I think rippled through the discussion today. That is, we're beginning this conversation at the wrong end. We begin by outlining that reform is impossible, and then we search for a few crumbs that have escaped the attention of the Supreme Court. I would argue we should start the conversation at the other end. Start with the status quo, ask if it's sustainable going forward, and if it's not, then ask what we can do about it. So, is there any opportunity coming out of today for boldness? Is there anything that the courts will not slap down? Surprisingly, to my mind anyway, there were some definite rays of hope. Just as some people were slamming the door, other people were trying to put their foot in and saying, not so fast, there are things we can do. So the first surprise to me for the day was a very spirited defense of the status quo, and not just from the senators in the room. David Smith argued, and I'm sorry he's left, he's quite adamant that we got it right in 1867, and if we got it right in 1867, it's good enough for us today, and sort of, let's get on with our lives. So we moved then, during the day, from a discussion of if it's broke, we can't fix it, to a discussion of maybe it's not broken at all. Maybe the status quo is working quite well. The second surprise, and I think the critical thing for me, is that the Senate emerged as the real motor of reform going forward. Andrew Hurd talked about Senate-driven reform, which I thought was a very interesting transformation of our thinking. It was pointed out in a number of ways that there's a lot of work currently underway in the Senate in terms of transformation. And senators appear to be reasonably protected from the intervention of the courts. I'm not sure. It was argued by Kate that internal change will not trigger Section 5. I'm not so sure. I suspect the courts may wade into this. But nonetheless, the Senate probably has greater room for maneuver than any other external actors. So there's a lot we can do to improve the status quo. I think the center could make a contribution by pulling this together. But, and there's always a but, will incremental internal change be enough? And here I think the answer is no. It's very difficult for the internal changes that we've been talking about to find traction in the general Canadian public. It doesn't understand the existing Senate, doesn't care for the existing Senate, and is not going to be too attentive to changes that are made, the subtle changes that are made in terms of the operation of the Senate. I don't think the internal changes we're talking about are enough to repair the Senate's reputation. And also, incremental change cannot get much of a grip on these larger structural problems that afflict the Senate or dominate the Senate debate. The appointment process, the distribution of seats, the role of the Senate in the Federation. I would argue, therefore, from and this comes out of your conversation, that we really need a new model or new models of the Senate, of what the Senate might look like. The existing models we have are badly dated. We're still looking through the rearview mirror into a Canada that's rapidly disappearing. So we need to look forward rather than back. We need to sweep off some of this old discussion, old models from the table. And here I would certainly offer up the EEE model as a good model to go, because it's not the model we need, I would argue, looking forward as opposed to looking back. I would suggest, although this needs to be tested, that the importance of territorial representation is not going to be as important going forward as it has been in the past. And that if we build future institutions that are designed around where you live, we're not going to find a constituency among a modern Canadian population that doesn't put a high priority on that. So I think we have to start looking beyond reform. We have to start looking beyond sort of tinkering with the existing model and really start again. Something that would horrify David Smith. The status quo, in other words, is the wrong starting point. It sets us off on a discussion that we've had before and is not one that the bulk of the Canadian population, I would argue, is that concerned about. So we can't have that larger discussion through internal change within the Senate. But the Senate, and perhaps only the Senate, can help animate or trigger that broader discussion. Linda Trimble proposed some great ideas about how we might be able to encourage that larger debate. I think we should also look back at the threat Pierre Trudeau made in the constitutional talks that if the provinces did not endorse a Charter of Rights, he would in fact go to the people in some way, do an end run around the provincial governments. Something we might want to think about. So we need a broader discussion then that goes beyond the internal reforms that we've been talking about today. And that discussion will only be animated by a larger vision that looks forward rather than back. As Bruce Hicks said, we need a new it to talk about. Most of the internal changes that we've discussed, and I repeat myself a bit, have no public resonance. They just don't connect with how Canadians are going about their lives. So where do we find the motor for Senate reform? Not in provincial governments, present time. I don't think that's in the cards. Not in the House. Not in the Supreme Court, as I've sort of tried to stress. And probably not in prime ministers, present or coming. Because prime ministers have a single sort of primary responsibility, and that's to ensure a Senate that is compliant or at least ideologically aligned with the government of the day. That's the first priority to his party and to his electorates. So then we're back to the point where the surprising motor of Senate reform in the short term is the Senate itself. Now, it's hard to think of a less bold statement than that. It sounds like an oxymoronism to even talk about the Senate as being bold. But we have, I think, coming out of this conference, an agenda for the Senate. The first part of that agenda is to get its own house in order. Much of our discussion was about that. Much of the discussion was about how the Senate can be improved, or as Senator Collins said, let us do our job. Let's clear away some of the stuff that's making it difficult. But this in itself is not sufficient. Internal reforms, even if successful, will provide little, if any, public traction. nor will a spirited public defense of the Senate achieve any real public traction. That's an option that's gone. So I think we need to animate that broader public discussion. We have to see internal reforms as a stepping stone to a larger discussion. And this then is the Senate's opportunity and responsibility to animate this debate. This is where we need boldness. This is where the boldness must come from the Senate, because I don't think it's going to come elsewhere. One last thought before I wrap up. There's been a fair bit of discussion about making the Senate a less partisan chamber. And nonpartisanship is often sort of the holy grail in discussions of Senate reform. And here I think the political science literature provides some useful insights. It shows a pretty clear definition of nonpartisans. They are people who live in caves or under large rocks. People with a passion for public life, with a passion for public policy, are the most likely to be caught up in the swirl and drama of partisan politics. That's simply the nature of the world in which we live. So we can draw the distinction that David Smith pointed out between partisanship and party discipline. I think that's a critical thing to do. But to talk about sort of a new era of nonpartisanship, to my mind, flies in the face of human nature and, in fact, functionality. So in conclusion, go back to the conference title, Time for Boldness on Senate Reform. Is boldness possible? No, in conventional terms. Is boldness necessary? Yes. So how do we get out of this box? Well, to my surprise, the path forward is through the Senate. But it's through the Senate. It can't stop there, because incremental change is not enough. An incremental change has to be a stepping stone to a broader national debate. So my wrap for the day is modest, conditional, cautious optimism. And looking back over the past 33 years, that's not a bad outcome at all. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Well, thanks very much to Roger Gibbins. Everyone on our planning committee had wonderful things to say about his abilities, and they were certainly not wrong. It was a tough day to summarize, actually. There was so much here. So just by way of final comments, I know you're all probably just really maxed out listening to people, but I just wanted to thank you all for your engagement. I mean, it's been an amazing day. And I think in terms of what we were speaking about last night, the ice and the ice breaking concept with respect to, you know, what the type of situation we seem to find ourselves in with respect to reform, I would say that there has been some ice broken here today. And what I see is that we've had this amazing dialogue. I mean, to have senators and politicians talking with each other, and senators and politicians speaking, and all of you and academics together, has been quite an amazing thing to witness for those of us who've been in the audience watching. And I congratulate and thank all of the presenters for just engaging so seriously with this subject. It's been a great day from that standpoint, so thank you. And I'd also like to thank the audience for being here and some of the wonderful questions that we had. Also to thank our planning committee. This is Peter Mikason, who pointed out this morning that he actually authored the amending formula in the Constitution. So he was pleased with Kate's presentation because he felt she really got it right. So that's always a kudo to her. But Peter Mikason, Aricia Lenny, Steve Patton, Rob Reynolds, Don Padgett, and James Muir, many hours of meeting and trying to construct this day that would somehow bring us to the point where we could seriously talk about Senate reform. So thank you. And also I would like to thank Dustin Martin, our Education Communications Coordinator, who did a lot of work on the conference, our administrative staff, Elsie Phillips and Carol Burgess, and our 2 student volunteers, Megan Semenyuk and Mirshad Masumi. Thank you very much for volunteering to assist. So there is wine and more food at the back for you. Please enjoy, and thank you very much. I think we've probably made some progress, as Roger has said, on the whole boldness agenda. I don't think this will be our last conference. Thank you.